Hello, everyone. Great to see you all popping in there. Welcome to this evening's digital drams at Fettercairn. We're just going to give it a few more minutes before we formally start, just for any late stragglers. You can all hear me okay, can you? Brilliant. Great to see the thumbs up there. Marvellous. Great. And I hope everyone got their packs okay and we're happy with that. The gift of purchase, the biro, I must say, very, very impressed. I don't know if you have one of these, Andrew. It was, yeah, when we were told, they wanted to offer a biro with the pack, I was kind of thinking they'd be kind of this, the regular biros you pick up in distilleries. I didn't expect this beautiful box to come in. So I hope everyone listening is pleased with that as I was when I came in the door. So brilliant. There's still a few people coming in from the waiting room. So I'm just going to give it until this kind of slow activity there, another 30 seconds or so, and we'll get started.
Quite, I'll be honest with you, look, I got a text message yesterday from one of my colleagues saying, are you all set for the W Club tasting tonight? And at this point, I just landed in France. And I texted him back, I was like, you've got to be kidding, it's definitely tomorrow night, right? And he was like, yeah, I'm an idiot. So I had a bit of a panic attack last night. But
well, I can relate to that because I was I don't know if some people who were on this chat might have been on our Bunna Haven tasting in January. I hosted that. Was the first tasting I hosted in the W Club. That was literally the week I started in this role. So for those of you who don't know me, I'm the new W Club manager. I started in January, having come over from Irish whiskey. So I used to do a lot of events like this with the previous company with tastings, kind of big and small. So it's something I've done for a long time. But when you haven't done one for a while and you're new in the role, so this weekend I was away with my partner the weekend, as we were discussing before we came on, and I woke up in the middle of the night, 4 o'clock in the morning, going, oh my god, it's 8 o'clock and I haven't, the Fettercairn Zoom started half an hour ago and everyone's sitting there waiting for me, and I was just like stress dreaming about the Zoom not starting, so, or me being away from the computer when the whole thing started. So I feel your pain in that sort of, you got to be kidding me. Because you want these things to go well. So that's enough boring small chat for all the customers there, guests who are with us tonight to experience whiskies. I think we've given enough time for any late stragglers. So yeah, we may as well get started. So I've just given myself a brief introduction. Do you want to introduce yourself, Andrew?
Yeah, I'd love to. Thanks so much, Luke. Thanks for arranging and for having me again. I recognise a few of you. Steve, how are you doing? Nice to see you again. But a show of hands, have any of you joined one of these Fettercairn tastings before? I would imagine quite a few hands. Yeah, brilliant. This is amazing. So my name's Andrew Lennie. I work as a brand specialist for Whyte and Mackay. I focus on 3 of our single malt distilleries, which is Fettercairn, of course, Tamnaville, and also the Jura distillery. So I work across those three whiskies. Before I worked with Whyte and Mackay, I worked in a small independent distillery called Lindores Abbey, which I'm sure many of you will know and have probably tried some of the wares coming out of that distillery over the last couple of years. And Lindores Abbey is where I grew up. I grew up in the small village of Newborough. You can literally see the distillery from my parents' house. So maybe in some way I was destined to work with single malt. I don't know. I just probably got very lucky somewhere along the line. But when I joined Whyte and Mackay, nobody had heard of Fettercairn. I was one of those people that I remember the Fettercairn Fjord. I remember some old Fettercairn bottlings, but in general, it was one of those whiskies that many people who I served from behind the bar when I was a bartender about 10 years ago, it's one of those whiskies that nobody had really come across. And it was probably one that was never really focused on as a single malt in its own right. But today, when we host tastings like this, or when I'm traveling around the country, speaking to people, everyone's asking what's coming out next, what's coming out next, what's next in the warehouse series, or what's your next 16-year-old. So everyone's starting to really kind of follow what Fettercairn are doing, and I think the ethos of whiskey making at the distillery is really good. So hopefully you're going to enjoy the 4 whiskies we have this evening. So we're going to kick off with the 12-year-olds. We're then going to have the 16-year-old from 2021. The third dram we're going to do is going to be the 22-year-old, and then we're going to finish with the brand new Warehouse 2 batch number 3. So if you want to line up your drams in that order, then that would be absolutely wonderful.
But, well, just if I don't mind, if I pop in there, Andrew, while people are getting their lineup. Obviously, what people got was upcoming release on the dram. So because obviously it was all secretive what was coming out. There was no no way of figuring out at all before this release. But just a bit of housekeeping I should have done at the start before we start. Because this tasting is being recorded, folks, and because for this tasting, this is actually the biggest participant tasting we've had in the W Club since the virtual tasting started, and our next one is going to be even bigger again. So because we've got larger numbers than we would have had pre-Christmas, and because of the recording, we're going to keep people on mute for the tasting. But that doesn't mean that we don't want to be interactive. So we want to hear your questions and your tasting notes in the chat box. Please do get them in. Don't be shy, because this tasting is about your experience with the brand. So yeah, please be confident and frequent on the chat, and I'll make sure that we get to all the points. So but out of the way, Andrew, sorry, I'll let you step back in there.
Not at all. I can see Robert joining us from the Isle of Jura virtually there, I think, as well. Brilliant. Great stuff. Great to see. But yeah, we're going to start with the Fettercairn 12-year-old. So fill your glass, and I'll just say a big thank you for joining this evening. It's always a pleasure, virtually or in person. So cheers, and hope you enjoy the 4 whiskies this evening. I think it's always good to have a little bit of a taste of something without any preconceived perceptions of what to expect. But definitely the Fettercairn 12-year-old is that whiskey that's going to introduce everyone to the Fettercairn distillery character and the range of whiskies that we produce. Luke, I was going to pick your brains actually a little bit as well and just see your opinions on this, because as we go through the tasting tonight, we'll kind of discuss a little bit about how the spirit is made at Fettercairn. We've got this kind of unique distillation process where we cool our stills from the outside with cold water. And actually, I've met many people doing tastings within the whiskey shops around the country that thought that it was a really good whiskey for people who were fans of Irish whiskey. So maybe someone like yourself who's kind of involved in that world would maybe agree or disagree with that comment.
Yeah, no, 100%. I have had the 12 before, but I must say it's the first time I've had it probably probably since COVID. And it really is, it has Bushmill is obviously famous for its, so you've got 3 distilleries on the island of Ireland who've been distilling for longer than 10 years. So they're probably the fair ones that people think about when they're drinking Irish whiskey. And Bushmills is known for that pear kind of fruity character. And this definitely has that. And the same with we were discussing kind of those juicy Cooley whiskies that get branded mostly as Tyrconnell and in Kilbeggan blends, because most people don't know the Cooley distillery, but they'll know the brands. And yeah, they also have that kind of fruity character, kind of almost kind of mix between Lowlands and Speyside. But I'm trying to explain it to a kind of a Scottish kind of palate when you're it doesn't have the kind of quite the robust double distilled nature of the Speyside whiskies. It does have that kind of fruity element, but then it's not totally fruit forward. So I definitely agree with you. There's a lot going there for someone who normally drinks a lot of Irish single malts. 100%.
Yeah, cool. I'm glad I'm not making things up. That's good to hear. But the 12-year-old's a great indication of the Fettercairn distillery character. And for anyone who maybe hasn't visited the distillery or doesn't know where we are, the distillery's up on the east coast of the Highlands of Scotland. And just to touch on something Luke said there, we talk about the sort of geography of Scotland. I think if we look back to maybe the 1700s or the early 1800s, when a lot of distilleries were either producing illegally or were founding themselves, I think there would have been not necessarily a Highland style. You've got distilleries in the Highlands of Scotland that produce big, weighty spirits. The Dalmore, of course, being one that I work with quite closely, which is up just north of Inverness. But you've also got big coastal distilleries like Old Pulteney. You've got really light spirit coming out of Glenmorangie. There's loads of different distilleries creating different styles of whiskey. So I think in the North Highlands and certainly in the east coast of the Highlands of Scotland, the whiskies that were being made were really representative of the people and the place. And that was kind of, I guess, their way of creating a bit of a personality within the whiskey that was being produced. The founder of Fettercairn Distillery was a gentleman called Sir Alexander Ramsay. So it was the Ramsay family of Balmain who inherited the Cask estate, and that's where our distillery is, in this big estate in the East Highlands of Scotland. And it was the Ramsay family that brought with them the unicorn. So you'll notice the unicorn on every bottle of Fettercairn single malt whiskey. It's the lesser spotted of the sort of animals you'll find in the whiskey world. We see lots of stags on bottles of whiskey across Scotland, but very few unicorns. And the unicorn's also the national animal of Scotland, which is quite a nice talking point when you're travelling around the world and people discover that fact that the national animal of Scotland is this mythical creature. It's quite fascinating.
I don't know, Andrew, on that, if you don't mind. I was told the other day, because I'm only obviously moved to Scotland, I was told the other day in the pub that the reason the national animal of Scotland is a unicorn is because unicorns apparently are famous for killing lions. You know, it's true.
It's not true. It's not true. Although in Edinburgh, certainly where I am today, you'll go around the city and you'll see the unicorn in shackles and the lion sort of holding the unicorn in shackles. But I think actually, if you look back in history, you'll find the unicorn dating back in Scottish history back to the 1300s. You'll find it in biblical texts when certain groups of people believed it was actually a real animal. But I think this whole thing about
wait, you're telling me it's not?
Well, I would say that whole thing about people believing it was the only animal that could kill a lion or was stronger and braver than a lion. I don't think that's necessarily true.
Edward Edrington in the chat certainly says it's true. So
who knows? I'm not going to start any fights tonight. All right, I'm just gonna enjoy my whiskies and we're gonna get through this in one piece. Hello from Boston, USA. Rich, hello. How are you? Wow. So yeah, the distillery's up on the east coast of the Highlands of Scotland, and the reason it's there is because Sir Alexander Ramsay owned Nether Mill, which is a corn mill, and Nether Mill was already working with the barley farmers, grinding barley. The workers in the 1700s had carved out a waterway that was taking mountain water off the Cairngorm Hills, which are just behind the distillery. So it was really perfect. It was a perfect place to make whiskey, and it was a perfect place for illegal whiskey making to be going on around about the 1700s and before. So if you ever visit the distillery at Fettercairn and you travel north over the Cairnmount Road, beautiful viewpoint that looks south towards Edinburgh over the River Tay and towards the River Forth. But that road was a famous drover's route, and that's where old farmers and Highlanders would march their cattle from the Highlands down into the market towns of the south. Market towns like Fettercairn and then down into the lowlands, into Glasgow and Edinburgh. And whiskey was being made in this landscape because it was easy to do so, avoiding the tax officers. So these people were making whiskey in very small quantities, hidden away in the rural Highland hills, and that way, anytime the excise officers came looking for them to collect their taxes, they could just pack up their equipment and run away. So lots of illicit distilling in that part of Scotland. Records of thousands of distilleries or illicit stills operating in the east coast of Scotland. But today there's really not many distilleries in that area. I think our closest neighbours are probably Glencadam. You've also got Royal Lochnagar, you've got Glengarry as well. So a few awesome distilleries in that area. But I think, when people are travelling to Scotland, as whiskey tourists, you'll probably land in Speyside in the Highlands before you land on the east coast, or maybe you'll go up the west coast of Scotland and visit some of the islands. So Fettercairn's one of those that most people just stumble upon on their travels. It's probably one that if any of you drive up to Aberdeen, you'll pass the distillery signs. But unless you've got a good reason to do so, you'll never travel inland and visit the distillery. Just going to read out a few comments here.
We've got a few coming in.
Yeah, Alan bought his first old Fettercairn around 1970, a mini 8-year-old. I had a dram of that last night in the Golden Promise in Paris, believe it or not. Very different style of whiskey back then, which I'll come on to in a little second.
Do you reckon, Andrew, that's the whiskey equivalent of ringing up the radio show and saying, long time listener, first time caller,
Maybe, yeah. You sure they're mythical? Haven't they just found a living haggis? Yeah, we've not seen any unicorns up at Fettercairn yet, but I'm sure a few drams might help that happen. Gavin's saying, when you mentioned Lindores Abbey earlier, you could do both tours in a day, only around 1 hour apart. I'm in Lawrence Kirk. Oh, brilliant! So you're local to the distillery, Gavin. Yeah, Fettercairn's about 2 hours up the road from me in Edinburgh, and certainly from Lindores, just an hour's drive. Two beautiful distilleries, and we hope to reopen Fettercairn to visitors around about June time. So we're building a really beautiful visitor centre at the moment, or we're renovating our visitor centre at the moment. And it is a great little part of the world. There's so much cool things going on. Where we've planted a forest at Fettercairn, which again I'll talk about a little bit as we go on. We worked with a land artist called Rob Mulholland, who's built a beautiful sculpture in the grounds of the distillery. And the distillery itself is just fascinating. It's all sights, sounds, smells. It's quite ramshackle, I would say. We've got equipment that dates all the way back to the Victorian era. We've got these beautiful spirit stills that are flooded with cold water from the outside. So lots going on. Definitely recommend coming and joining us when you get the opportunity. How's everyone enjoying the 12-year-old? We've had a couple of comments there. I think that it's quite an easy drinker, light. You can properly knock it back.
Yeah, well, I think Adam's comment there about that is more of a hint as to where we're at with that first one. I know mine's pretty much got only one drop left in it, but it's certainly a gorgeous drop, all right.
True story. As I say, I worked with Lindores Abbey Distillery before I joined Whyte Mackay, and the Lindores Abbey Distillery is in my hometown, so working there was absolutely amazing. But it was a young distillery and it didn't have whiskey yet. So I was approached by Stephen Martin, who's my colleague now today, and we met at an event in Glasgow, and he said, we're looking for someone to talk about Fettercairn. Do you know anyone who'd be interested? And I hadn't tried the new 12-year-old. It was only launched in 2018, so I hadn't tried it yet. So I went into the Ben Nevis in Glasgow and ordered a dram of it, and I just thought it was absolutely amazing. I agree that it's a really light, clean style of whiskey. At the time, it reminded me of Glengoyne, which is one of my favourite distilleries. And I just thought, the whiskey was doing all the hard work, so it made my job much easier. And having worked with Fettercairn over the last 2.5 years, I just think that everything the distillery's doing, the way that our whiskey makers are creating whiskey, and the sort of the nod that we have, I guess, now to sort of transparency and the sort of integrity of the bottlings, I really like. So I think it's a great place to be. Good opener, Steve. I agree. Steve's probably had this as an opener quite a few times on our tastings. Yeah, he's nodding. Yeah.
There's some tasting notes in there as well. Alan says, S. McDonald says, yes, toffee and a nice spice. Gary says, found this to have a peppery back taste, and now the sweetness is coming through. I didn't get the kind of peppery. That's, I suppose, the beauty of the game. Very subjective. Andrew also says initial sweetness from the 12-year-old, then a bit of spice, pepper, and fruit apple. Robert says really light, smooth and sweet, nice length to the flavour, hints of almonds alongside fruit. And Andrew says, I'm at Lindores tomorrow. So it's the Abbey, not the chocolate, Andrew, is it?
No, we almost got into trouble at Lindores. I'd say in trouble. Lint Door tried to refuse us using the name of Lindores, but we told them, well, it was an abbey that dates back to 1191, so you can't do anything about that. And they said, as long as you don't make chocolate, it's absolutely fine. So that's what happened.
Both exceptional at what they do,
Absolutely. So we're talking about the flavour profile and sort of what we expect at Fettercairn. We're always looking for a tropical fruit. Our house style is very light. There's a lovely sort of pineapple mango note, a little bit of sort of overripe banana that you'll find in the new make spirit. And that's really something that we hope to carry forward through all our range of whiskies. And I think when we talk about sort of tropical fruit in the world of whiskey, it's probably language you don't hear very often. And that's a really nice place to be. I think we've got a really unique sort of house style. And I really kind of was thinking to myself, like, how does a distillery create a funky tropical fruit flavour when it's made with the same ingredients that every other distillery in the country uses? And the reason for that, I think, is that if you look at a flavour wheel for anything, if it's coffee or beer or wine, if you look at a flavour wheel under the sort of malty category, what you'll find is things like overripe banana, dried mango, pineapple, coconut even. And these kind of funky tropical fruit flavours find themselves in there. And because at Fettercairn we've got some old traditional equipment at the sort of beginning of the process, our mash tun is one of only 3 cast iron tumble rake mash tuns from the Victorian era still in operation in Scotland. And because of that old equipment, what we do is we actually retain quite a lot of the solid barley in the beginning of the process. So we create our wort, which is cloudy. And typically, if you create a cloudy wort, what you're going to get is a very biscuity, meaty, rich style of spirit. And then if we go over to fermentation at Fettercairn, we ferment for about 60 hours. So over the last 7 years, we've expanded our fermentation a little bit longer for extra consistency and that lovely fruity ester that we're looking for in our beer. And then we double distill. and it's not the wash stills, but the spirit stills at Fettercairn that are fitted with these cooling rings. And it's really this process that's helping us create sort of a balance of the maltiness that comes from the barley, but also these wonderful sort of fresh fruit notes that are coming from that extra reflux created by cooling down the copper of your stills. And kind of really simply, what's happening here is when distillation is happening in your spirit stills inside the copper, the more that the distiller can make the vapors interact with the copper, the more you're going to clean the spirit, refine it, break the particles down, and create a sort of lighter, more vibrant style of spirit. I think typically at Fettercairn, before the 1950s, when these cooling rings were introduced, I think it would have been quite biscuity, quite rich, quite cereal forward. But because the cooling ring actually takes the temperature of the copper down from 80 degrees to 30 degrees, we get this really really interesting bit of reflux and this kind of clean, fresh spirit.
But Edward's got a really good point there. That's saying that's really interesting to hear. I get fed up with saying flavors all, or people saying flavors all from the cask. And you mentioned Irish whiskey earlier on. I mean, obviously, it's apocryphal to say that all Irish whiskey is triple distilled. It's not even close. But the big brands are, and that's obviously creating that extra copper contact that you were talking about. So from a basic kind of standpoint, it makes sense that your nature of cooling the stills would replicate something of triple distillation with that extra reflux, extra copper contact.
Absolutely, yeah, I definitely agree. I think with grain whiskey and things that maybe are triple distilled, you often pick up a really kind of coconut note. I find it in a lot of grain whiskey that's at a higher ABV, coconut and chocolate. And I think with Fettercairn you get a little bit of that. A few people have talked about spice. I certainly get a little bit of ground coffee at the background of the 12-year-old. And as we go down the line, I think that sort of spice element comes in towards the end, certainly with the 16-year-old, which is going to be the next whiskey we taste. Just before we do that, I'm going to try and share a video, and this could work. It might be a minute of a frozen screen, but we'll try. Because the spirit stills that I'm talking about at Fettercairn, you really kind of have to see them to, I think, really see what's going on, because they're really fascinating. So let me try and share this video with you and see if this works. Here we go. When we come to the 40 and 50-year-old, they're a real celebration of the treasure trove of aged stock we have. So for our 50-year-old, it spends... don't know who was in charge of that editing, but it was a terrible job. But yeah, just a little glimpse of the stills there, so you can actually see them. Quite fascinating. When you take people around the distillery, your eyes kind of fixate on these big kind of copper monuments sort of thing. And I was speaking to our head of distillation at Whyte and Mackay, a gentleman called Shane Healy, and he said that what they used to do at the distilleries to keep casks moist when they arrived was actually they would wrap hose pipes around the casks that would lie outside of the distillery, and they'd perforate holes within the hoses and just turn them on, basically to keep water in contact with the wood so that the casks never dried out. And what we think is that in the 1950s, the distillery manager, who was called Alistair Menzies, or Mingus, we think that he introduced that same process to the stills. And at every distillery in Scotland at that time, you used to have an engineer. And at Fettercairn, it was a gentleman called John Twigg. And he basically took this idea that Alistair Menzies had and created these copper cooling rings. So it is just a tube of copper with perforated holes, and the water comes in from a natural spring that's collected in a dam behind the distillery, floods down the top of the stills, is collected in a sort of reservoir at the base of the still and sent back out to the dam. So the water just kind of circulates round and round and round. And it's quite an innovative way of cleaning up your spirit. If you imagine trying to change the distillery character of a distillery like Fettercairn, you would have had to rebuild the stills and completely, change the building. But this was a way of sort of trying something. If it didn't work, you could just take it away and you wouldn't have damaged anything. but it changed the spirit character, and it's still in operation today. So today we have 2 spirit stills, where he would have only had 1 in the 50s. We doubled the size of this still house in 1966, and it's still the original cooling ring on spirit still number 1 as well. So really innovative sort of thinker, I think, Alistair Menzies. There's some really cool articles about what he was doing at the distillery way back when.
No, it sounds awesome. And how are the stills heated?
So they're steam driven. Yeah.
And is that steam coils running internally in the still, or is that steam coming from below?
Yeah, they're internal steam driven coils within the spirit stills. Yeah. So yeah, the spirit character is kind of funky. It's not a really light spirit. There's still an oily kind of texture there. It is still a little bit malty, as I mentioned, and it can stand up to all sorts of different cask types and different types of maturation. And that brings us on to dram number 2, and that's our 16-year-old for 2021. So this is the second release of Fettercairn at 16 years old. The first release we launched in 2020. And we have the third release of 16-year-old coming out later this year. But the idea with our 16-year-old is that the liquid will change every year. So it'll be completely different. It will be an annual release, and every time we'll use different casks to mature the whiskey. So this is the first time that we're talking about a whiskey that's partly fully matured in Oloroso sherry butts. So some of it starts its life in Oloroso sherry and is fully matured that way. Another portion of the whiskey is matured in bourbon barrels first, before being finished in rare and aged Palo Cortado sherry butts. So these Palo Cortado sherry butts are extremely rare. We got them from a bodega called Gau in the south of Spain, a distillery which was family run and actually closed for a long, long time. And the sherries that were in these casks were 50 and 60 years old. So the sherry and the wood have had a long, long life journey already before we got the casks over in Scotland. Our master whiskey maker is a gentleman called Greg Glass, and he has a gentleman called Diego who he works with in the south of Spain. So Diego kind of calls out these distilleries, and Greg goes out and handpicks some of these casks. So Palo Cortado sherry is really the sort of mystery of the sherry world, and it sits somewhere between Amontillado and Oloroso in style. It's a very dry sherry. There's no sweetness in there at all, but it is a big old sherry. So by the time we get these casks in Scotland, the wood's going to have a probably less of an impact than the previous contents of the cask, which of course that lovely nuttiness of the sherry. What is the mix of casks by percentage? That's a very good question, and one that I don't really know the answer to be honest, Rob. But what I would say is give it a taste, and you'll see how much the sherry casks have an influence. Alan is asking there, what exactly is chocolate malt? So chocolate malt was what we used in batch number 1 for Fettercairn 16-year-old, and it is it's barley that basically you when you're drying it, you roast it to a high temperature over 2 hours, basically to caramelize the sugars in the barley, so that when you distill that, you get loads of that chocolatey flavor coming through. You get less spirit, but you get more of the that rich sort of biscuity, nutty flavor.
It's often used in brewing, am I right? Or
yeah, the same that you'd make for a porter or a stout or something like that. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think you can instantly tell that, whereas the 12-year-old was very high in vanilla and that toffee note that a few of you mentioned and the kind of lighter fruit flavors, I think this becomes much richer. It's like taking all those tropical fruit notes and sort of mulling them with spices or drying them and adding that extra bit of intensity. We're also up at 46.4% ABV, so a little bit higher, which gives you that lovely texture. When we've not chill filtered the whiskey, you get that lovely mouth coating sort of tannin that comes through from using these old sherry butts.
It's very tannic. So totally different, much more almost, I don't know, savory or than the first one. It's an interesting whiskey.
It's one that
what was the difference between this one and the 2020 release in terms of casks?
So the 2020 release, we used chocolate malted barley, and we used port casks and sherry butts as well. So Port's so good when you've got a whiskey that's a little bit higher in ABV, because port is made with red grapes, so loads of tannin. Whereas with these old sherry butts, it's probably less about the actual oak influence itself and more about the sherry, because the sherry's been resting in these casks for 50, 60 years. And that's what's bringing that kind of nuttiness forward. I think if you've ever been lucky enough to visit a bodega in Jerez, you walk in and you feel that smell almost instantly, that big sort of raisin, tobacco-y, leathery smell. It's kind of captivating. Was the first one coloured and chill filter? Yep. So that's something that a lot of people will ask with most distilleries, to be honest. Do you use colouring? Do you use chill filtration? For Fettercairn 12-year-old, we use colouring and we use chill filtration for consistency. It's not a batch release, so literally that's the reason we do that, so it looks consistent from year to year and from country to country. With all the other whiskies that we've released, they're all natural colour, and they're all non-chill filtered as well. And that was one of those decisions I kind of mentioned after I'd been working with Fettercairn for a few months. It was a kind of commitment we made to go for these sort of integrity bottlings, which I really like, because I think the audience is pretty much in favour with that. Be interesting to hear your opinions. I think there's a kind of whiskey for everyone in this lineup tonight, so it doesn't bother me one way or another. But I think you get more at higher ABV. Robert's saying deeper flavour and easier drinking for a 46.4. Less fruit, more chocolate. Yeah, I agree with that. 100%.
It's got it's I can see, you can smell the alcohol on the nose. It is quite punchy. When I nosed it, I thought this is good. But yeah, Robert's right. Once you actually get it on the tongue, it's actually, you wouldn't even know it was 46.4.
Yeah. So although each of the whiskies are going to be different every year, the ABV is going to be the same every time. So our whiskey makers are trying to create a whiskey at 46.4%, I guess, again, for consistency. But I think what might happen with the 16, and this is just an absolute guess, but maybe we'll find one recipe that we really love, and that might remain a consistent in the lineup of whiskies that we produce. What I do like about the way we're making whiskey, and we're doing a lot of kind of small batch releases, and we're doing some limited releases and things like that, is that you kind of eventually start to discover some hidden gems in whiskey shops around the country. So when you pick up a bottle of 16, you can look at it and try and figure out, like what year is it? The vintage is going to be on the front of the bottle, so you'll know, oh, this is the first release, or this is the second, or this is the third. You're constantly kind of going to be stumbling upon something really interesting. And that's something, again, that carries through into the Warehouse 2 collection. Just some really kind of playful whiskies. Steph is asking what the price is on the 16-year-old.
Yes, so I have it here. So the 16-year-old is 105. That's for a litre bottling that we had in stock. Now it's actually out of stock at the moment. I was guaranteed we wanted to make sure it was in stock for this very tasting, because I've got a discount code for you to share at the very end. But it's going to be back in stock tomorrow. So the discount code that we're going to share to the end is going to be valid till the 27th of this month. So by lunchtime tomorrow, the 16-year-old will be back in stock. So I'm not sure if it's coming back in the 70 cl or the 1 litre form, but it was 105 at a litre was the last one we had in stock of the 16. The 12-year-old is 46, and we plenty of that in the 22 to go for you right away.
That would have been the batch 1 was the 1 litre, right? So batch
yeah. I think this is batch 2, but the batch 1 was the last one we had available for sale, which is still in a few of the shops. So I think, yeah, I'm not sure. I presume it's the most recent batch is coming in tomorrow. I doubt they would sell the older one, but yeah, so they'll be back in stock tomorrow. So.
Yeah, it'll be a 70 cl of the one that you're drinking just now. Yeah, absolutely. Interesting point, Gary, saying that you could see you enjoying that around the festive period. We actually launched this in November, so it was very much that time of year, which was perfect. Even a glass of sherry on the side was a really interesting way of kind of tasting this one. And I totally agree. Loads of spice, and really chocolatey and kind of a little bit of coffee coming through at the end, which is lovely. Wonderful. I was thinking actually about the order tonight, and we could have actually gone from 12 to 22 years, because these are both whiskies that are both fully bourbon matured. Of course, the 22 is just an extra 10 years old. And the 22 is actually going to be the third whiskey that we try tonight, and it's one of my absolute favourites in the collection. I think Fettercairn 12 is brilliant, and it's quite clean, it's fresh. I always describe it as being quite juicy. I think when you get to 22 years of sort of slow, patient maturation, you develop this sort of funky kind of white chocolate thing, coming from the sort of the dunnage environment, where these whiskies come to life. So we'll move on to the 22-year-old and see what you think. And I would recommend comparing it to the 12 and seeing what you think. So with the 22-year-old, what we did was we the first time we made this whiskey, it was spirit that was distilled in 1996. And then after 13 years, in 2009, we actually recasked it into fresh distillery run bourbon barrels. So what we mean by that is basically, we get these casks from the US, or straight from a bourbon producer in the States. They haven't been washed with water. The barrels haven't been stripped down and put back together again. They literally come still moist. We empty them and we fill them with we filled them with a 13-year-old spirit, and we matured it for a further 9 years. So although it is a 22-year-old whiskey, what we've tried to do here is retain as much of the sort of freshness and vibrancy as possible by using this recasking sort of process. And just always using first fill bourbon means you get loads of freshness, and that really nice sort of juicy thing continues. But as I say, the 22-year-old has a funky kind of chocolatey thing that happens towards the end. And what we have at Fettercairn is amazing. We have 14 warehouses that are all traditional dunnage warehouses. So the casks are never racked more than 3 high, and they're always on rails, horizontally stored. And this is just a very sort of traditional way of maturing whiskey. And we believe at Fettercairn that it's a perfect environment for our single malts. So everything that we bottle is matured on site. It's to the eye of the distillery manager, Stuart Walker, and of course Greg Glass as well, when he comes up to investigate the casks for the next Fettercairn whiskey. So all bourbon matured. It's kind of one of those examples, I guess, of simplicity. It's really, really simple. We want the distillery character to shine. We use good casks, and I think this is an absolute gem of a whiskey.
No, it definitely is. Yeah, you're right. That it's a bit more spicy, a bit more tobacco-y, a bit more kind of chocolatey than the 12, but it retains a lot of that complexity on the front of the mouth. It's gorgeous. Yeah.
Yeah. I think for anyone who's had the opportunity to try Fettercairn 28-year-old, it's a real different beast. The 28-year-old we made using refill bourbon barrels, and some hogsheads as well. So it was less about the wood influence with the 28 and more about that slow, steady maturation, and it became almost like an antique style, and it was very walnutty, tobacco-y. There was like a mushroom kind of note in there. But with the 22-year-old, I think it's much more classic house style. 47% ABV this time as well. So again, bags of distillery character, a nice weight, texture. Edward's saying reminds me a wee bit of a Jamaican rum. That's interesting. Maybe a bit of sort of that molasses coming through.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. Yeah, and great bourbon, sweet, fruity, long finish. Says Alan. Why the 47, Andrew?
So, as all whiskey makers will tell you, even changing the ABV by 1% changes the flavour hugely. And when it comes to bottling the whiskies, it's always about choosing that right ABV to sort of carry forward, as I say, the weight, the texture, but also flavour as well. So a lot of the time when it comes to analysis of new make spirit and things like that, we'll take things down to 20% where it's not going to overwhelm the palate for our whiskey makers. But for 22 we decided on 47. I think it gives us that opportunity of, again, not having to chill filter, so you get that really nice texture. It's quite creamy, I think.
This is more like an Irish whiskey to me than the 12-year-old, big time. But yeah, no, it's very good. Steve just said a couple of drops of water opens it up. I've literally just done that myself. I haven't tasted it yet, but I don't know if anyone else has tried that. Would you add water to your 22-year-old, Andrew?
Do you know what? I typically don't add water to whiskey because it just changes the mouthfeel a little bit for me, and I don't really love it. What we did do one tasting was we paired the 22-year-old with a cold peach spring water on the side. So we had this kind of almost like palate cleanser, like a cold sparkling water with a hint of peach in it, and that just kind of just acted as this little palate refresher, which I absolutely loved. It was something I stole from one of the things we did with Jura when we paired the Seven Wood with a glass of cold water with cucumber in it, which I thought was really nice actually. And by doing that, we weren't compromising the whiskey sort of drinking experience. We weren't compromising what was in the glass. We were just trying to create something that made it a little bit different.
Compromise is a strong word. Roger Till says water does help a little. It lifts the spice. Robert Murdy says more reminiscent of the 12-year-old, but spicier finish, still light again and very easy to drink. So if you wouldn't recommend water, would you recommend a few ice cubes in this? Or?
Again, it's a personal preference. It's not something that I tend to do. Do you know what? The one whiskey that I absolutely loved with ice in it. So I loved the Balcones distillery from the States, from Texas. But all the whiskies that I've tried from their distillery tended to be like really super spicy, you know, like really intense. I can't remember the name of the bottling I have. It's behind me somewhere. But it was super strong, really high ABV, really big on spice. And I didn't enjoy it at all. I couldn't enjoy drinking it until I added some ice to it. And it just came alive. It was absolutely amazing. So there's definitely whiskies that can take ice. It's just not something that I personally ever do, to be honest. Maybe a little bit of water every now and then, but pretty rarely.
Herbal. It says water brings out herbal, grassy notes to me. Perfect straight, no water. So there you go. Is there? Well, never mind. I'll ask this question after we've come on to the. Well, I'm not saying we've come on to warehouse now, but it's another question about ABV. But I suppose with the warehouse release being at a higher ABV, we maybe come on to that on that one. So yeah, when did it? Obviously the 16 was relatively new to the market. The 22-year-old, when was that joined the core range?
That came out in 2019, I believe. Yeah. So when I joined, we had 4 whiskies in the portfolio. We had a 12-year-old, a 28-year-old, a 40-year-old, and a 50-year-old. So you imagine trying to do a tasting like this, and that's the only 4 whiskies you've got in the portfolio. It was pretty tricky. And what we've done is we've kind of added over the years to fill in those gaps between 12 and 28 years. But actually that in itself, I think, tells a little bit of a story of the history of Fettercairn, because it's been a distillery for almost 200 years. But I guess over the last 20, 30 years, it's supplied single malt whiskey or spirit to blenders. So probably everyone in this call has tried Fettercairn before within a blend like J&B or Johnny Walker or Whyte and Mackay, of course. But, Fettercairn was just providing a spirit for blenders, and that was enough for business, particularly before the sort of, I guess, the whiskey locks of the 1980s. So when we came to relaunch Fettercairn as a single malt, it took years of planning to make sure we were going to get it right. Because, the old bottlings of Fettercairn didn't get a great write-up. They didn't really have much of a unique quality. They kind of were a little bit smoky, a little bit sherried, and they just fell a little bit flat, to be honest. And absolutely no trouble saying that. I think what we've done now is create something with a really strong identity and a really cool house character. Adam's just asking how much we make a year. So
yeah, I think he's asking your salary. Is it? How much do you make a year? It's a very personal question for a whiskey tasting, but I'll allow it.
I'm gonna answer how much whiskey we make a year, and that's about 2 million liters of pure alcohol every year. And that's on a full tilt. We operate 24 hours a day, 7 days of the week, and we close at Christmas time, and we close in the summer as well. That wasn't always the case at Fettercairn. I did figure out recently that actually, until I'm trying to think when it was, until 1990. No, is it 1990? No, it was after that. It was about 2000 and I'm trying to think what year it would have been. 2010. We were
1990.
Yeah, I was thinking. So Stuart Walker, he started in 1990 as a warehouse operator, and then Bruce, who's the assistant, he celebrated his 10-year anniversary when Stuart was there 30 years, so it would have been 2010. And until then, running up to that point, they distilled 9 to 5 Monday to Friday. So it wasn't until a little bit later on that we started going round the clock. Do you mature it all on site? We do. Everything that's single malt whiskey from Fettercairn is matured on site. The only exception would be when we send casks up to Invergordon, which is where we have our blending centre. And that's where casks will be sort of vatted together. Or sometimes we do sort of cask to cask transfers there. But most of the time at Fettercairn, what we're doing is cask to cask transfers on site, which I'll come on to when we taste the Warehouse 2 batch 3, because this is it's quite a complex way of making whiskey, but one that I think's kind of cool to talk about.
Well, just before we come on to that one, there was one question from earlier, and I can't see who said it, so apologies for that, but you mentioned the age of the distillery, and they were asking, they said in 2024 you'll be 200 years. Have you any plans around that?
I did see that question, and I totally forgot to call it out because that's a good one. We want to celebrate Founders Day, which at Fettercairn was the 26th of June, 1824. That's when James Stewart signed a letter asking for Alexander Ramsay to give him permission to basically operate the distillery. We also have what we call the Fettercairn 200 Club, and all our barley that we get is malted down at Baird's Malt in Arbroath, which is just 20 minutes or so south, not far at all. And what we have is we've sort of enlisted 200 local farmers from within a 50-mile radius of the distillery, and they'll provide us with 100% of our malted barley. And Baird's Malts, they celebrate their 200-year anniversary around about the same time as well. So this is a really amazing partnership, which kind of helps us keep things local. I mentioned Stuart Walker, our distillery manager. He came from a farming background, born and raised in Fettercairn, and these are people who he knows very well and who he grew up with. So just to have that connection back to the people who actually, this is their livelihoods on the land, I think is really important. So we'll be launching that sort of big collaborative project around about that time, and hopefully we'll have the first of our Founders Day sort of gatherings. There is a Highland Whiskey Festival. There's obviously Fégil on Isla. There's Spirit of Speyside in Speyside. And there's a Highland Whiskey Festival, but it's closer to Dalmore sort of territory. So we wanted to do something for our distillery, and hopefully we'll do that in June around about Founders Day.
I'm just looking forward to that. Do you want to come on to the warehouse?
Absolutely. Let's do it. So this is Warehouse 2 batch number 3. Each of these whiskies is anniversary bottling, Steve. Maybe we'll do an anniversary bottling. I'm sure we'll have something.
2 years away, Steve. Calm down.
But the Warehouse collection, we decided that we would celebrate our favourite warehouse at Fettercairn, which is Warehouse number 2. Number 1 and number 2 warehouse are the originals from when the distillery was built. Again, as I mentioned, typical dunnage warehouses, earth and floor, and just a perfect place for maturing whiskey. We actually monitor this warehouse every single day. We monitor the temperature, the airflow, the humidity, just to see if that has an impact on flavour contribution. And as we go further down this series in the years to come, there'll be a lot more different experiments kind of coming to fruition, and hopefully we'll have a good understanding of sort of what each of the warehouses does to the flavour of whiskies. But in warehouse number 2, you'll find some of our oldest stocks. I think the oldest cask we have on site is a 1965 sherry butt. But we've also got a little area where Greg has his more sort of is kind of experimentation ground. These are casks that he's filling that may become the next Fettercairn. They might not, but he's sourcing casks from lots of different places. Greg has a real passion for wood. He works with the local foresters. We'll come on to that in a little minute as well. But also, with the different wood types around the world. So Hungarian oak, we've got French oak in there. We've got Scottish oak. But for Warehouse 2 batch number 3, it was kind of a whiskey born of a concept, and the concept simply being red rum. That rum and raisin sort of idea. And I don't think I've ever had a red wine and rum matured whiskey before, but maybe one of you guys has. I'll let you mention if you have. But what we've called out here is that some of the spirit was distilled in 2015. but it wasn't all distilled in 2015. Actually, a significant proportion of this whiskey was distilled in 2007 as well. So the bourbon element of this whiskey was predominantly matured from 2007. But some of that younger component, the younger Fettercairn spirit, really brings that freshness alive. It's almost becoming quite floral, I think, on the nose. So we call out, of course, the youngest spirit because that's what we always do with whiskey. But we've also named the sort of percentages of cask types that we've used here. So we've got 57% bourbon, we've got 27% ex rum barrels, and we've got 16%. Is that good maths? Yep, maybe. Is it? Yeah, 16% is red wine barriques. So the red wine casks are coming from the Bordeaux area in France. They're Cabernet Sauvignon red wine casks, which give you loads of tannin and loads of red fruit. So lots of nice red fresh fruit flavors. The rum barrels that we're using here are really interesting. And we never talk about the actual Caribbean rum producers themselves. But these casks actually came from a blending company based in London who created a blend of Caribbean rums, and they matured it in Fettercairn barrels. So these were ex-Fettercairn barrels that we supplied to this rum blender in London. And Greg Glass, our whiskey maker, was actually kind of a consultant on the blend of the rum. So he was part of this flavour panel creating this rum. And then when it was made, we got the casks back again. So they've gone from Fettercairn to this rum blender back to Fettercairn again. And Greg said that he was using the rum barrels or ex-rum barrels to add that little bit of tropical fruit flavour, that kind of patisserie spice thing that you might find on the end of the whiskey as well. But I think the thing that I noticed the most on Warehouse 2 batch number 3 was that in the middle of the whiskey, for me on the palate, is when the red wine casks started to kick in. And it's almost like sometimes you get a sort of sweet balsamic note from red wine, you know, that kind of vinegary acidic quality. For me, that comes in at the middle, and then it becomes really spicy towards the end. But I think the nose is really fresh and vibrant. It's really cool.
Yeah, rum and red wine reminds me of my days drinking red biddy, you know.
Yeah.
And for while we taste and digest that, this obviously isn't out till Friday, so officially on general release. So W Clubbers are getting really advanced treat on it in terms of being able to purchase it priority notice at the moment, and before it comes out anywhere. So it's a real treat in terms of tasting it tonight and purchasing it. Alan asked how much it is. It is £60, and as I say, until Friday, it's exclusively to W Club members. So everyone who bought this tasting is a W Club member. So yeah, you'll have to be logged into your account to buy it. So fantastic stuff.
A couple of nice questions there as well, actually. One, just quickly, with all of the Warehouse 2 releases, we only use a handful of casks. So for batch number 1, we use 19. For batch number 2, we use 29. And for batch number 3, we've used 25 casks. They're all different. So batch 1, we used a combination of port, sherry, virgin oak, and bourbon. For batch number 2, we used rye and bourbon barrels. And for this one, we've got bourbon, we've got red wine, and we've got rum as well. And they're completely different whiskies, which I think is cool about this collection. You know, one might appeal to someone and not appeal to someone else. You know, some of the batches are going to be more spice forward, like batch 2, for example, which was rye and bourbon. It was really spicy, really juicy. Whereas this one, I think, almost got a kind of floral, kind of like, what were those, like rose kind of sweeties, that floral gums. It's got that kind of thing going on, which is really interesting.
Turkish delight type yolks.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Dave in the chat says we got an email earlier today about Warehouse Batch 3. Yeah, that was the launch of it to W Club members. And Adam's question about the discount on Warehouse. No, after this tasting, we get a discount on all the regular core range, I'm afraid, Adam, but not the Warehouse Batch 3. So if you were holding off on buying a Batch 3 till after this tasting, you shouldn't have bothered, because yeah, I'm afraid there's no discount on that one. Robert says, how many bottles has it produced? Really good balance on this.
That's a really good question. I think we've made about 300 8.4 litre cases. So if you multiply that by 300 by 12, I'm not good at maths, so I'm going to really struggle with that. Someone do the maths for me.
1,000, we'll say. But...
It's usually between 3,000 and 5,000 bottles worldwide, I think. Terrible maths. Awful. But yeah, I love this whiskey. I always get really excited when we've got another warehouse release coming out, and I think, as I say, there's kind of something for everyone there, which is quite nice. There's a very sort of playful kind of fun element to the way that Greg and Stuart work together to produce whiskies, and I think this is absolutely no exception. I was talking earlier quickly about cask to cask transfers, and I think what most people would think of when you're imagining hand picking 25 casks and making a whiskey, you would imagine just taking them all, putting them into one big vat, and then bottling them. But what we do here is we take bourbon barrels and then we individually transfer them into rum barrels or red wine barrels. So what that does is it leaves you loads of headspace in the casks. So we're not taking a bourbon barrel or several bourbon barrels and filling the red wine casks right up to the top. We're actually just taking the bourbon barrel, filling it into a red wine cask, and leaving whatever the headroom is in the barrel. And that's what Greg says promotes loads of fruit flavors. It's actually that headspace within the cask, which is kind of interesting. Have we experimented with peat? Adam is asking. Well, the distillery did produce peated barley fairly regularly historically, but we stopped doing that about 12 years ago now. So there are casks within the warehouses which are heavily peated. The old bottlings of Fettercairn used to blend in the peated casks in very small quantities within the recipes, but we don't do that anymore. Everything that we do is about the unpeated barley and that lovely tropical fruit note. That's what we're kind of going for. I guess a lot of people might say that sort of big peat smoky goes really well with tropical fruit. So maybe we'll do that at some point.
Gavin says, if I'm honest, Andrew, I'm not sure on this warehouse whiskey. I'm sorry, we have to take the crunchy with the smooth, Andrew. I had this and the 12 on the shelf. I probably drink the 12. I've drank a lot of 12, so likely I just need to give it a chance. It is also, going back to the ABV point, Gavin, it is over 50%, but it's a 50.6. So maybe trying it with a drop of water might suit you. I know Andrew's doesn't like water, but yeah, I think adding a drop might put it more in your ballpark, and then you get more value for money because you water down your whiskey, you get more of it.
That's a very good point. Never thought of it like that. But I think this is really interesting, and yeah, Gavin, to your point there, like this is a collection of whiskies that are always going to be quite different, and there'll be something for everyone, hopefully. Loads of kind of experimentational kind of bits and pieces, but always trying to make sure that the house character is sort of is there within all of our official releases. Probably loads of you will have tried Fettercairn as an independent bottling from someone in the past, and we obviously as a company have no control over those. So you get really great examples, but you also get some that are a little bit lackluster. So everything we do from the distillery is aiming to be the best version of itself that it can be. A couple of
comments in there. The council have shut off Robert's water because he said he would try. He's got none left. Ian says my favorite is the 16, but batch 3 is good. I think my favorite was is between the 12 and the warehouse. I'd say maybe the. I mean, I do actually. To be honest, it's between the 22 and the warehouse. But if I'm looking at the 22 is quite expensive. Not for what it is, it's great whiskey. But if you're looking at this for 60 quid and the 12 for 46, I always keep an eye on my wallet with my money as well. So while I do like the 22, it's maybe I'll stick with the other two. Steve says 16 a warehouse for you. Do you have a favorite on the bottling in the terms of this lineup, Andrew?
It just depends. It depends what mood I'm in, to be honest. I quite like that comment that who's that saying that my favorite is where are we? Stephen, saying that he prefers this year's 16-year-old bottling, which is quite interesting because what we thought with batch 1 when we did the chocolate malted barley with port and sherry, it was a big like sweet slap in the face. It was very like I love it, or if you don't want a big sticky sweet whiskey, then maybe it's not for you. But with this year, I would say it's much more well balanced. It's kind of subtle and it's complex, and there's loads going on. I think it's kind of testament to some of those really old sherry casks. I think they've been used in a really nice way. For me, go to 22. If I have one open, then that's absolutely one of my favorites. But certainly the warehouse collection's been really interesting, and I think this one's really cool. Some of that younger spirit in there, just giving it a little bit of a kick, which is really nice.
Marvelous. We have a few more comments. Ian says, I liked both batch 1 and batch 2. Batch 3 is amazing. Steve says 16 stood up well on the 3-way tasting with Jura and Dalmore, so that's high praise. Edward says 16-year-old is lovely, but my least favorite as it loses some of the fruitiness. I think that's, the 16 is really interesting whiskey, but in terms of, we were talking about, you were saying maintaining distillery character and everything, it definitely is the one that is a bit the odd one out in this lineup tonight. Dan and Catherine say 22 for me here, but 16 for Catherine with some water. Colin says 16 was excellent, and Dan says but 22 without water. So he's got there's layers to this game, you know. With him.
Just before we part company, I realise we've been on for just over an hour. I'd just like to say a massive thank you to Luke for having me, to Ruth. Ruth's on with us somewhere this evening. I see her name there. Thanks for organising as well. Much appreciated. And yeah, massive thanks for coming along and trying these whiskies. Really interesting insight from you all. The distillery's got some incredible things going on. Greg Glass has been working on his Scottish Oak programme for a number of years now, and we're delighted to say that later on this year we'll have the first commercial bottling from Fettercairn finished in Scottish Oak. So this is going to be an 18-year-old whiskey. And, you know, we've not just been filling 1 or 2 Scottish Oak casks, we've filled hundreds now across all of our distilleries. And particularly at Fettercairn, working with the Fask estate, with the forestry there, working with naturally fallen Scottish oak trees and processing them at the Fask sawmill, which is literally right behind the distillery, and then working with the Speyside cooperage. And we have this internship program where we're teaching young coopers how to make casks from Scottish oak from the very beginning of a tree falling to turning it into a barrel that can be used to mature whiskey. So we've done loads and loads of work on Scottish oak in the background, and I'm really excited to say that we have that first commercial bottling coming out later this year, and that'll be a Fettercairn 18-year-old, which will be another permanent addition made annually from the distillery before we start adding more and more Scottish oak into the fold. So that's something definitely to look out for. We've also got another 16-year-old that will come out this year, which is another kind of bigger sherry bomb. We're using Pedro Jimenez casks for the next one. And we've also got batch 4 of the Warehouse 2 collection, which I think is Hungarian oak. Don't quote me on that though, because I still don't have all the information. But loads of cool things coming out from the distillery, and yeah, definitely keep your eyes peeled for some of those.
No, that's fantastic, Andrew, and thank you for coming on. It's been great working with you and you mentioned Ruth and everyone at Whyte and Mackay over the last few weeks, and getting this ready for this tasting and this release. Really good quality whiskey, and you're a great gang. So thank you for having us, or allowing, you know, coming in and doing this for us. I've put the discount code 15% off the core range in the chat there, so anyone who gets it, it's WS15FMVT, and that is valid until the 27th. So make sure you jump on that. And the 16 is out of stock at the moment, as mentioned, but we'll be back in tomorrow. I'm told by the warehouse it'll be lunchtime. So if 16 is your one, don't sober up. Just hang in there until tomorrow. So do you want to address a few more questions before we finish? Just some of the last ones in there.
Absolutely.
Adam says the 22 is best, but I have to wait until my Grand National winner comes in next year. Gavin says, when do you reopen for tours?
So it should be June time. We're hoping to be a little bit earlier in May, but big renovation. We're building a bit of a bar area in our visitor centre as well. So when we do reopen the doors, there's going to be loads to see, and we'll keep you all posted on when that is. Be absolutely amazing to welcome some of you up to the distillery again. Nice picture there of the old Fettercairn distillery. I can see the logo there. That's brilliant, Alan. Love that.
There you are. Steve says he's looking forward to his visit. Chris said, how much would the 16-year-old be when it comes back into stock? I can't confirm until it's in, Chris, but I believe it's going to be £65 again. Unfortunately, the stock ordering and pricing is not in my remit. So, but I can't imagine it'll change. But don't quote me on that. The 22, we mentioned the 22. I think looking back through people's comments on terms of what they preferred, I'd say the 16 probably shaded the tasting. So that's really interesting to know. So is there anything else? I know you've kind of given your final kind of spiel. Edward, I'd say put it in your basket and find out. He says, I get 15% off the 46-year-olds. There's only one way to see. So yeah, thank you everyone for coming. If there is any more questions, if you want to email them to the link, the info at link that you would have got the Zoom link from, and I can forward them on to Andrew or someone else and get them answered if there's something we didn't cover here. If you're watching back on the recording, thank you for joining us, and hopefully we'll see you live on the next one. So yeah, thank you very much everyone, and for those of you who are joining us tomorrow for Singleton, look forward to seeing you then. So thank you, Andrew.
Thanks so much, guys. It's been an absolute pleasure. And we'll see you on the next one, I hope.
Brilliant. And I'm going to send out the recording to everyone tomorrow, and the discount code will be in there as well. So if you missed it tonight, don't worry. Brilliant. Thanks very much. We'll talk to you soon, Andrew.
Thanks all. Have a good night.
Bye.
Take care.